The good ones are, yes, I can think of some pretty good funny stories. The good ones are ones that tie into some local organization, an organization in the state, that they come in and they just adopt Paul Wellstone's campaign organization. Because those people have worked together before, and so they can trust each other, they can distribute decision making, and they can do rational things. And they may or may not be at the very top of the level of technical competence. But where a campaign comes into a state and takes over typically a U.S. Senate or a governor's campaign, maybe one that was run 2 years ago and it's still around, and there's sort of I hate to use the word machine, but there's sort of a machine left behind, that can work pretty well. And in fact, those are pretty formidable in those states. That's probably why incumbent governors' endorsements are powerful in states that they actually have organizations behind them. Now, that's a good example of how to run in these states other than Iowa and New Hampshire. Unfortunately, it's very rare. It's hard to think in Michigan who, if you came into the state and you tried to take over an organization, what organization exists on the Democratic side that you could, for example, take advantage of, for, say, in 2016. I can't think what that is. Now, to talk about the bad ones, there are just any number, but one of the best bad ones I can think of, in 1988, there was a caucus which Jesse Jackson won. And Jesse Jackson's people actually had a plan, and their plan was that because the caucus was so badly organized by the Democratic Party, there were only going to be about, let's say, 300,000 total votes cast. Well, there are 800,000 black registered voters in the state. And so if you get 1/8 of all the black registered voters in the state to get up and go vote for Jesse Jackson, he'd win the caucus. And that's what they did. And towns that had little black populations, there may be 200 black people who live in Clinton County who were registered voters at the time. And they got 30 of them to show up at the caucus. And 30 of them was more than the Dukakis people could mobilize in Clinton County. And so Jesse Jackson, I believe, carried Clinton County. He certainly carried Ingham County because he could get, 10% of all the black registered voters to go out and vote. Where Dukakis kept asking, so who are the likely voters? Well, there aren't any likely voters because we don't hold caucuses. We've never done this before. There's no list. You have to make your own. Well, but who voted the last time? Well, there wasn't a last time. And at that point, whoever we were talking to would fly out of state and they'd bring in somebody else. They actually, one of the best people for Dukakis, best stories, not best competent people, arrived at Metro Airport and asked for directions to drive to Marquette. Well, the first thing to do would be get it back on a plane and fly to Green Bay, because you really can't drive to Marquette from here, at least not sensibly, right? Well, anyway, that was typical. He was from Massachusetts, and he assumed that if he flew to Boston, you could drive to any place in Massachusetts, just hadn't actually looked at a map. So I don't know how he ever got to Marquette, but he'd been assigned to Marquette, and that was where he was supposed to go. Well, the better example, the less funny but more typical example was, we hold these caucuses at these sites. The only people voting in are either black people who Jesse Jackson has gotten fired up, and some white activists, but basically Jesse Jackson knew his target audience. You could identify them at a distance because of what they looked like, and so that was helpful. Whereas the Dukakis people, you can't identify at a distance because, as far as Democrats and Republicans, people who like Dukakis, people who don't, they all kind of look alike, right? There are millions of people, and maybe there were hundreds of thousands who would have voted for Dukakis if they'd been gotten to the caucus site. But you have to go ask them, are you interested in politics? How do you feel about Mike Dukakis? You have to identify them. Well, you have to run a campaign to do that. And of course, they couldn't do it. So they flew in all these people who were on paid staff, and they went to the caucus sites on caucus day. I remember the MSU Union had a caucus site for East Lansing. And they handed out flyers to people who were coming to vote. Well, what in the world could that possibly have accomplished? The only people who show up at the caucus site are people like me, a county commissioner, longtime labor activists, people active in the ACLU. All of us, know far more about the campaign than the volunteer does. and Jesse Jackson motivated blacks. There are no undecided people there. So what in the world is the purpose of having people flown in who are on paid staff handing out flyers at the polling place? There are no undecideds. Nobody's walking in to do this and about to read a flyer and decide who to vote for. And that was the Dukakis campaign, and we couldn't talk them out of it. And I kept saying to them, have you ever thought of calling people, get lists of Democratic activists or people who voted in past primaries, and just phone thousands of them and ask them if they support Dukakis and would be willing to vote in a caucus for him, and then explain, because none of them have ever done it, we've never held a caucus, right? How you would do it, where it's located. You might even, I told them, you might start with people who live within 500 feet of the site, right? So go to Mount Pleasant and think about the houses within 2 blocks of the church where their caucus is being held, because hell, they know where the church is. They could walk right over, they could vote. Anyway, they knew too much about that. So Dukakis did his campaign, which involved handing out flyers to people who already made up their minds. Jesse Jackson did his, which involved rounding up every black registered voter they could put on a bus, and they just moved them to caucus site and ran them in and had them vote. And Jesse Jackson won the election going away, won the caucus going away, and it was regarded as a stunning triumph for Jesse Jackson and all of that organization. And the Dukakis people were stunned at having lost everything. They got wiped out, just almost completely wiped out in the state. And of course, Dukakis went on to win the nomination, but his showing in Michigan, if they had done this incompetently everywhere else, and if the situation had been, if it had been nothing but walk-in caucuses in states that had never held a caucus before, with Jesse Jackson able to rent buses and Michael Dukakis handing out flyers at the polling place, Jesse Jackson would have been the nominee for the Democratic Party. It was just good that other states had elections that were held under different rules, because under these rules, Dukakis was going to lose every one.